Hi, Liz Bowen with Realty here, and I wanted to take a couple of seconds to talk about appraisal gap. What is appraisal gap? Why is everybody talking about appraisals right now, and how buyers can use appraisals to get the bid, right? To get their offer accepted. So let me start with a little bit of a history lesson and talk to you about what our Colorado contracts have to say about the appraisal process. So in a neutral market where we don't have, really low inventory, but buyers and sellers have the same amount of market power, which usually describes a market where there's around 4, 5, even 6 months worth of inventory available, the appraisal process goes like this. The appraisal is ordered by the buyer's lender when you're under contract. And that appraisal is used to determine the appraised value of the home. And that appraised value could be different than the negotiated and agreed upon purchase price between the buyer and the seller. So what happens in the event that the appraisal comes in lower than the negotiated purchase price? Well, traditionally, and based on what we find in our Colorado contracts, the buyer has a couple of rights. They have a couple of opportunities. Now, if the buyer's using cash or a conventional loan, there are deadlines that are built into our contract by which time the appraisal has to be done. And if there's a problem with the appraisal, an objection has to be made. Okay, so we do that in writing, let the seller know there's a problem with the appraisal, and we're required to provide some kind of proof about what the appraised value is, either a copy of the appraisal itself or a letter from the lender. The lender's only going to loan what the appraisal says is the value for the home. So you can understand then that if the buyer and the seller have negotiated a purchase price, but the appraisal comes in low, that's a problem for the buyer, but it's also a problem for this transaction, right? So the buyer says, hey, we've got a problem with the appraisal. And the buyer at that point can work with the seller through their realtors to negotiate a resolution of some kind. Or the buyer can terminate the contract and get their earnest money back, as long as they do it by the dates that are in the purchase contract. Again, if this is a cash or a conventional deal. So the buyer can terminate, or the buyer can object and say, hey, we've got a problem, let's work on a resolution. Now, historically speaking, this appraisal process is designed to not only let the lender know what the value of the home is, but it's also to protect the buyer, to make sure the buyer doesn't overpay, because the appraisal will determine or basically let us know what the value of the home actually is. So it protects the buyer because they don't overpay for a property. So, the normal thing that would happen in a neutral market is that in most cases, the seller would reduce the price of the property. That purchase price would be reduced down to the appraised value because, hey, that is what the house is worth. Maybe the seller instead wants to appeal the appraisal, get a second opinion. Those things are all possible as they're negotiated through this process in a regular deal. Now, things are a little bit different if you're using FHA or VA financing because there are no deadlines, okay? But the process is still basically the same. The appraisal has to come in, and the buyer has the right to terminate if the appraisal isn't for the purchase price. And then there's potential for negotiating some kind of resolution. We just don't have deadlines that we have to keep to. So that being said, the appraisal has always been an opportunity to make sure that buyers were getting properties for what their value was. Now let's fast forward to today's real estate market. And here in Colorado Springs specifically, but basically, not just in Colorado, but around the country. And we're sitting here at mid-year in 2021. We are seeing a dearth of inventory. I mean, basically, there's hardly any homes available. I like to joke around that there's 4 houses that are, on the market right now, and that's about it. But to be honest, in Colorado Springs specifically, we're looking at like 0.3 months worth of inventory, which means that all of the houses that are available to buy are going to be gone, gobbled up in 10 days. It's just crazy. So that means that the market power rests firmly with the seller, and buyers are often finding themselves in multiple offer situations. So then folks kind of put their thinking caps on and thought, well, what can we do to make sure that we get our offer accepted? And one of the techniques is to put in the offer a clause that indicates the buyer's commitment to come to the table with cash if there is a gap between the appraised value and the purchase price. Now, this kind of makes sense if you think about it. If buyers are overpaying on purpose, right? They're offering more than the list price, 10,000, 20,000. I'm hearing about 50 and 100,000 over list price. And that's not normal, guys. I just want you to know that's not normal. But when buyers make offers over list price, then the seller accepts that offer. If the property appraises at the list price, the seller kind of feels cheated, if they had to come down, drop their price to the appraised value when it was the buyer who was offering more than list price. So having this appraisal gap clause where the buyer's committing to cover that gap, that difference between what they offered and what the house is valued at based on the appraisal, kind of feels fair, right? If you're the seller. Don't promise me all this extra money and then turn your head at the deal when the extra money that you are promising me doesn't really coincide or line up with what the value of the home is. Now, the other way of looking at it is that buyers might also be thinking, well, I had this safeguard, the appraisal process, and now I'm willingly giving up that safeguard. And now I know that I'm overpaying for the house. But didn't the buyer kind of know they were overpaying for the house when they offered more than list price anyway? So how do we fix it, or how do we implement this technique? Talk to your real estate professional. But what we really basically do is we put a clause in the offer that says that the buyer will come to the table with X dollars to cover any gap between list price and appraised value. So it could be a portion of that dollar amount. Maybe there's a $10,000 over list price contract, and the property comes in, it appraises at the list price, but we have this $10,000 gap. So in the offer, maybe the buyer commits to half of it. Right? Buyer will provide $5,000 in cash at closing to cover any gap between the appraised value and the purchase price. Or maybe the buyer is going to offer to cover all of the gap. And what that basically tells the seller is that, number one, the buyer does have some money. Number two, the buyer is willing to commit and make good on their promise for that above list price offer. So the sellers feel very good about accepting an offer with this kind of promise or this kind of appraisal gap coverage. It basically requires buyers to make sure that they have enough money, right, to cover an appraisal gap based on the offer they're making and the list price of the property. So it doesn't make sense for buyers to look at properties at the top end of what they can afford if they know they're going to have to, provide an offer that is over list price by a certain amount and come to the table with the difference in cash. So buyers need to be prepared, if they want to use this technique, to have money, right? Not just their down payment, not just their loan closing costs, not just the earnest money, which of course is a credit to them at closing, or the amount of money to cover having inspections done and any of the due diligence. But they also, if they want to use this technique, need to be prepared to have the extra money that they're offering over list price in a liquid form that they can provide at closing to cover the gap. I hope that this has been helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to DM me or reach out. My name, again, is Liz Bowen with Red Bow Realty. Our website is redbowrealtyusa.com. And thank you for watching.